1 Timothy 4:16 ranks as one of my favorite Bible verses because it's affected the way I've thought, the way that I've lived as a Christian over the past several decades. But before I read 1 Timothy 4:16, can I ask you a very simple question? Without thinking about it, what is your basic gut reaction when I say the word doctrine? Now, if you're an average North American evangelical, it's probably negative. And that's because over the past several decades, the importance of knowing basic Christian doctrine has been downplayed while the experiential, the emotional has been elevated. And so many tend to view the study of doctrine as something that is dry, something that is boring, something that is academic, something that only affects up here but not down here. So knowing basic Christian doctrine at its best is just a waste of time. At its worst, it's a threat to spiritual vitality. And that's why 1 Timothy 4:16 is one of my favorite Bible verses, because in it, Paul, he strikes a balance between the importance of knowing basic Christian doctrine with the importance of living it out. And how, well, if you don't combine the two, if you don't strike that balance, then you won't be able to fully live out the way God intends you to do. In 1 Timothy 4:16, the Apostle Paul, he wrote this. Writing to Timothy, he said, "Watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers." So why did Paul write this? Well, here's the background story. Right at the beginning of 1 Timothy, Paul reminds Timothy why Timothy was in the city of Ephesus. And that was to command certain people to stop teaching false doctrine. You see, Paul had spent about 3 years in the city of Ephesus, and if you know anything about Paul, that was a long time. He had spent 3 years planting churches, discipling the Christians there, with the intent that when he went off to plant churches elsewhere, those churches would be able to self-replicate in Ephesus and spread the gospel to the surrounding regions. But in his absence, false teachers had swept in. And just not from outside of the church, but also from within, who were teaching false doctrines and were threatening to literally undermine everything that Paul had labored for. And so at the beginning of chapter 4, Paul reminds Timothy about what God had clearly warned would take place, that they were living during a time when people would abandon the faith and follow doctrines that were demonically inspired. Because the demonic realm knows that if they can get a Christian to have the wrong thoughts about God, then that changes everything. It will change the way they think about God. It will change the way that they live. Without sound theology, any worship, no matter how sincere, will in the end be corrupted by the vain imaginations of the human heart. It's sort of like the happily married wife with kids in the movies, who one day discovers to her horror that all of this time her husband has been living a double life, that everything that she thought she knew about her husband, everything that she loved about her husband was purely fictional. And according to the Apostle Paul, that's the main goal of the demonic realm, to sidetrack the church from her mission by getting her to worship a fictional version of God. And that's why I've also mentioned numerous times in other videos that the greatest act of spiritual warfare isn't yelling and screaming at the devil, but rather joining other believers in the study of Scripture and encouraging each other to live it all out. So throughout the rest of chapter 4, Paul urged Timothy, as a preacher, to commit himself to expound upon the Scriptures and to teach sound doctrine. That Timothy wasn't just only to guard down here, but also up here as well. That he wasn't just to guard how he lived, but he was also to guard his beliefs, what he believed. And it was only by combining those two things, only by striking the balance between those two things, would Timothy not only save himself, but also save his flock. In so many of our churches today, we place such a great stress upon having an experiential, heartfelt faith, which is good, of course, but if it's not guided by correct beliefs about God, if it's not guided by sound doctrine, what will prevent us from being led astray? Guard your life and your doctrine.